Welcome to our first presentation on writing a legal letter. Writing a letter is probably the most challenging document that we'll create in this course, and we'll be doing several of them. So my suggestion is that you take careful notes. Please write down my cheat sheet information as we go through it so that you'll have that available to you. Because if you just listen and do this first letter by following the instructions, you may find that you don't have perfect recall when we go to do our second and third and fourth letters. So having those notes will save you the hassle of listening to this presentation more than once. So let's get started. The first thing to cover is, when do we send a letter? What is the tripwire that tells us a letter is the right way? Primarily, it's going to be who our audience is. We talked about when we used interoffice memos that that's to somebody within the law firm. But once we leave the law firm and send it to somebody outside the law firm, we're going to be using either an email or a letter. So if you were to imagine a Venn diagram, the interoffice memo is strictly for inside the law firm, and a letter is strictly for people outside the law firm. An email can be both. So if you were to imagine that situation, you'd have a circle here for um, interoffice memos just in for the law firm. You have a circle over here for letters that are just for people outside the law firm, and then an email would include both of those circles. So the decision really isn't, should I send a legal correspondence or should I send an interoffice memo? That pretty much answers itself by who your audience is, who your recipient is going to be. But the issue that you're going to more likely face is, should I send an email or a letter? And really the differences are, how formal is a document, and do you intend to cover anything like a complex or subtle or privileged issue? If it is more complex, then you're going to want to use a letter format instead of an email format. Um, so here's the definition that I have here, and this is one I made it myself, so it may not be particularly eloquent, but hopefully it captures what you need to know. So a correspondence is a communication sent by a mail service that is in the format of a traditional letter. Now, when I include mail service here, it could be UPS, it could be FedEx, it could be US Mail, or it could be an email system. You can definitely send letters via email. You would include it as an attachment to the email. A legal correspondence is in the same format as any other business letter, though is likely to be more formal than many business letters. So the things that I'm going to cover in terms of format would apply. Let's say you decide the law is not for you and you become an architect or an accountant or an engineer. Awesome, wonderful. You can use this exact same format that we're covering today in your professional life, wherever it might lead you. Now, a legal letter is probably going to be a little bit more conservative and a little bit more formal than your average one. But a good rule of thumb, really, whenever you're writing anything, is err on the side of formality. You aren't going to offend anybody if you're a little bit more formal than the situation requires. But if you're too informal, that's when you run the potential of getting yourself into trouble. And so knowing how to do it formally allows you to meet everybody's expectations, and you're ready to go into those circumstances. Another thing I'd like to flag before we get into the nuts and bolts of how we write a letter is that I'm going to show you a particular way to write a letter. It is not the only way to write a letter. In fact, I can practically guarantee you that wherever you end up practicing, the way that letters are done in your new law firm will not be exactly the way that I do them. What I try to do is show you a very conservative, proper, legal way of writing a letter. It is not the only way, but it is the only way for this class. So if you present your letter in a different format, you're going to lose points or you're going to have deductions happen. So follow the way that I'm talking about doing a letter in these series of lectures, but just keep in mind that if you go to work for somewhere else and they do a different way, it doesn't mean that they're wrong. It just means they have a different way of doing things. When I was in private practice, it wasn't unusual. in small firms or in legal departments to find that different attorneys had different preferences for how letters ought to be formatted. And so there were legal secretaries and paralegals who had to adjust the format for the particular attorney with whom they were working. And so for one attorney, they might do a block format for a letter. Another attorney, they might do a modified block format for a letter. So it's a good thing to kind of get used to the idea that that you are going to need to be flexible about when you indent, when you don't indent, and all those specifics. So the system I'm going to show you, keep in your back pocket. This would be great for when you're sending out your resume, and also keep in your back pocket if you happen to go to work for a firm that doesn't have a kind of calcified systems in place here. Maybe you can use this system if it works for you. But just be aware that it's not the only game in town, although it is the only game in town for this particular class. Okay. So let's get started. Let's go through the nuts and bolts of how we do letters. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to uncover the first section, which is the letterhead. Or actually not the letterhead, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. We're going to talk about the global formatting issues, and you'll see that these are very similar to what we talked about when we were doing the interoffice memo. So we're going to stick with that 1-inch margin all around our documents. And again, the way we find that out is we go to Layout, and we go to Margins, and we just pick Normal. Okay, we're done. That's all we need to do to get our margins set up. And then we're going to set our font at Times New Roman 12 point. Again, it's good to do that globally. We're going to go to Home. You can see I have Times New Roman and 12 point already set up. But if I didn't, I just click on this little symbol there and I can go ahead and set it. Once I've set it up the way I want to, I set as default and I'm good to go. I'm going to cancel it because I already have it set up. Then you're going to turn off any spacing that automatically spaces things. And so you want to have, actually I had it set up differently for this one, but you're going to want to have 1.15 and you're going to want to have the word add and the word add there. Then you're good to go. When you're working on documents, you're welcome to do double space when you're, kind of figuring out what the content is going to be. But for letters, you're going to want it to be single space, or actually 1.15 spaced when you actually get ready to send it. So you can keep it at 1.5 space throughout the process or change it from double spaced to 1.15 spaced. So now we have our global settings ready to go. Now we're going to move, so be sure to write down all this information before we go forward. Pause whenever you need to get the content that you need. So, or if you would prefer, watch it a second time and freeze frame me so that you can get the material down. The reason, by the way, that I ask you to actually write down the material is that the act of writing it down is really very helpful in learning the material. And so that way you will have not only heard me talk about it and seen it, you will actually written it down, and you'll find that's a lot easier to retain that information going forward. So letterhead. Letterhead is the top of a letter. It's only used on the first page of a letter. So you're only going to see that information on that first page. And typically what goes on that is going to be the name of the firm, its physical address, its telephone number and facsimile number. It may include names of some of the partners, especially named partners. And it may have some kind of uh, symbol or interesting, kind of marketing tool to make it stand out. Many times it will be in bold, and many times it will have different color fonts, different size fonts. It's likely, almost always, in fact, it's going to be printed on the paper already, so it will have gone to a printer, and so it won't be something that you actually type in. Sometimes you will need to type it in. For example, if your law firm is very new or operating maybe on very modest resources, you might need to type it in. Also, if you've changed locations recently, maybe the paper from the printer hasn't come back yet. Again, that would be a time that you would actually type the letterhead in. The letterhead is a marketing tool for the law firm. Law firms are somewhat restricted in how they can market themselves because of the ethical rules of the Bar Association. And so letterhead kind of is an important statement, one of the few that a law firm can make. As a result, you don't want to change it. You want to stick with the law firm as it exists. Obviously, if it's already printed on the paper, you don't have to worry about that. But treat whatever letterhead, macro you're given as if it were already printed on the paper. So don't change the font, don't change the margins, don't do any of those changes to the document. Keep it exactly as it is. Again, you're going to want to have your letter be a single page. There are times in your career where you will have a more than one page letter. That's fine. There's times where that's appropriate. But for this class, every single letter that you prepare will fit easily on a single page. If you're struggling to get it on a single page, you're doing something um, more than what you need to do. You're welcome to reach out to me and I'll help you figure out what's gone awry that you're finding it difficult to fit on one page. So you never have to worry about, well, what do I do on the second page? I'm going to tell you though, on the second page, you don't use letterhead because in your career you will eventually need to do that. Okay, so for this particular course, you will only need one page. So on the second page, you're not going to use letterhead, but in the area where you would have used letterhead, you're going to include information such as the page number and the recipient's name. So this is how you might present it. Let's say you're writing a letter to Susan Austin. You would say letter to Ms. Austin. If you wanted to include her first name, you could, but this is fine. Then you're going to say page 2 of, well, however many pages the letter is. And then usually you're going to include something that identifies the letter. Perhaps you routinely write to Miss Austin, and maybe she keeps all of these letters, but she's not very good about keeping them organized. Well, she wants to be able to easily sort through and get the letter that this is the page to so everything is in nice sequence. Well, putting the date on it or the topic of the letter from the ray line can help Miss Austin or somebody in your office easily sort them. You don't need the third item, but it's certainly a nice thing to do. The first two items, though, are very typically done. And these are going to sit on the left margin. I have indented them here so that they kind of stand out here, but when you're doing it, it's going to be at the top left margin. So the very top of the page, on the second page, on the left side. Okay. But again, for this class, you need to know this for tests, but you don't need to know this for any of the documents that we're preparing. So let's go on to the date. Here we go. Have it? Oh, yes, we do. Okay. So the date is going to go one or two lines below the letterhead. So if you have the letterhead here, you're either going to have it directly below so there's not a blank space, or you're going to skip a line and then have the date after that skipped line. You may think, well, how do I decide? Well, it's probably better to have a skip line because you want there to be a clear demarcation between the letterhead and the actual letter, the stuff that you're typing. And it does tend to look better if you happen to have a little space there. But again, sometimes you might find, gosh, I have to be very economical about my space to keep this all on one page. And so this is an area that you could take away a line. You could push the date up to right below the letterhead so that it all fits in there. Let me go back to the letterhead for a second. I was going to say something and I forgot to. And that is letterhead can be of many different types of font, many different colors, many different size. Please don't worry if the font is not Times New Roman. It very likely won't be. Even in firms that use Times New Roman for all the typing, they may well use a different font for the letterhead. Don't change it. I'm not going to count off if you happen to, um, if the letterhead is different. I don't want you to change the letters. So I know you might be, well, should I change it to Times New Roman? And she told me to keep everything in Times New Roman, or she told me not to change the letterhead. Listen to the second voice. Listen to the one that says don't change the letterhead. I have an example here of the marketing the law firm uses. This isn't a letterhead example, but if you think about Nike, when we think about Nike, we think of that swoosh, that symbol they have. Well, sometimes law firms have symbols like that. Maybe the law firm's name, that the two, let's say it's, Edwards and Green. They might have an E and G kind of intertwined together in somewhat of a fancy, maybe almost like an Old English font. That is the equivalent of their swoosh. And so we want to um, let that voice, that marketing position speak out. We don't want to change it. And even if there isn't something distinctive like that, we still don't want to change it, because I promise you, somebody in the law firm spent a pretty fair amount of time thinking about exactly how this letterhead ought to look, and they do not want you to make any changes to it. Okay, sorry about that. I lost some of my train of thought. Now we're going to talk about the date. So the date is the date that the letter actually enters the mailing system. So again, if you are at the law firm at 8 p.m. at night finishing up a letter, but it doesn't actually get into the mailbox until 8 a.m. Monday morning, you ought to date it for Monday morning. If you really feel like this letter needs to go out today, then you actually need to physically put it in a mailbox. It's fine if the letter is not going to get postmarked until later time. Maybe you're putting in the mailbox at 10 p.m., but it's not actually going to be picked up by the mailman until, 8 a.m. the next morning or something. So the postmark will actually be a day later. That's fine. But what you're saying is, I've lost custody of this letter on this particular date. A lot of times people leave the date blank, or they will put the date they think they're going to mail it. They might put that in bold, or maybe put it in highlight so they won't forget to make that change. We're going to use the same format that we talked about when we were talking about interoffice mail. It's going to be the month, capitalize obviously the first letter, spell out the whole month, make a space, then the day. It's going to be a single digit if it's 1 through 9, 2 digits if it's 10 through 31, then a comma, and then the year. This is the format we're going to use throughout the course, and we're going to use it everywhere. There's one place we won't be using it, but we'll talk about that later. We haven't gotten to that. But everywhere in a letter, we're going to use this format. We aren't going to put THs or STs or NDs in it. So we're not going to do this. Right, we're not going to, or we're not going to do this. Not a good practice. So we're going to stay with this. Because I should add, here we go. You oftentimes will find that you include the letter in the body, the date in the body of the letter. In that situation, we're going to use exactly the same format. Okay, so we have the date set up. So a little reminder, we're also not going to do this. We're not going to do it in the, I guess, maybe European style. That's not what we're going to do. We're not going to abbreviate October to this. No, we're not going to do that. We're certainly not going to do this. We're not going to do 10/3/2020. Not going to work either. Okay, so we have the date set up. Now we're going to position it in the letter. This is the single most common error people make in my class. So don't be that person. The way to do it is you aren't going to hit center. Let me just show you what the center key is like. If we go up here to home, you'll see there are 4 buttons here. If we hit this middle one, you can see all those lines are centered. It centers the content. It's not completely centered because our margin here is a little off, but if I push it here, it is centered. But that's not what we're going to do. What we're going to do is we're going to use that tab button. I'm going to turn on the Pilcrow here. we're going to use the tab button to tap to go to the approximate center. This isn't something you're going to measure. You're just going to eyeball it. You want it to about the center. If we were starting on a fresh line which had no content, oops, here we go. So here we're going to do about 5 or 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'm going to do 6 for this one. This is about the center that we're looking for. If it ended up being 7, that would be fine too. As soon as people like to, you'll see later on that we're going to do something with that number. So you might make a notation. Alternatively, you can just look up here and see on our ruler where we are, and you can see this one is set at 3 inches. So you might just make a mental note, okay, it's at 3 inches. If you can't easily eyeball it, scroll it up so you can see exactly where it is. Okay, so we've positioned it. We're tabbing it. Now you might say, but it's not going to be perfectly centered. If you really, really want it perfectly centered, here's something you can do. You can center it again. Again, you're going to, this isn't a good, let me just put it on its own line. We're going to center it, and then you can see where this comes up. And you can set your tab. I'd probably set the tab for right here. You could set a tab for there, and now I can uncenter it and tab it. So if you really like that perfection, you can achieve it. You don't have to use preset tabs if you don't want to. I'm not going to be getting out a ruler and measuring your tab locations. As long as it's in the ballpark and it looks like you genuinely tried to get pretty close to centering, we're good to go. I'm not the centering police. So that's how the centering is going to work. So remember this. This is a super common error. I don't want you to lose points for that. So we are now done with our first part of the letter. We have done our date. Let's go on and do the next part of the letter. Okay, here we go. I'm going to look at this. Let's look at something though before we go forward. I'm going to remove this just for a second. And you can see, gosh, my fifth bullet, or not fifth bullet, but fifth numbered item is at the bottom of the page. Should be mode of delivery somehow or another. I lost that. Here we go. Mode. I must not have made that. Here we go. Oh, there we go. That doesn't make sense. You don't want to have a heading at the very bottom of the page. There's 2 ways you can solve this. One way is kind of lazy and not what I recommend. The other way is much more elegant. So the lazy way of solving it is just to hit return. And eventually you'll get to the next page. And now it's at the top of this page. The problem with this approach is, let's say later on I decide, well, gosh, I really want to add that example back. So I'm going to, oops, I forgot my content. But let's say I went ahead and added it here. So we're going to go with letter to Ms. Austin, page 2 of 4, June 14th, 2020. So now you can see that this has pushed this down, and so I have this extra space that I really don't need anymore. And so it requires me, when I just use the return button, to constantly adjust my document. Another problem with using the space bar to get things nicely set up is that sometimes different versions of Word will have page breaks at different points. And so you can't be certain that the recipient, when he or she opens up your Word document in his Word version, will see exactly the format that you do. You can control for that by PDFing it, but let's say you choose not to. Maybe you're sending it to your secretary and you want her to print it up for you. Well, you don't want to PDF it under the circumstances. So the method of adding extra spaces it may be easy initially, but it ultimately adds sometimes more work. Now let me begin by telling you what I'm going to suggest that you do. Wait until the very end. Don't worry about the fact that this is on the last line or something along those lines until you're done with the entire document. It's probably the last thing that you'll do before you print it up. And what we do here, I'm going to go ahead and remove our example here. Okay, so now we have it back on the last line. So what we're going to do, what I call a hard page break, is I'm going to hit the control button. The control button is right below the shift key. And on my keyboard, it's on both sides. Some keyboards, it may just be on the left side. So I do the control key. A lot of times it's written CTRL. So I hit the control key, and now I'm going to hit enter. And it gives you a page break. And what this means is that let's say I add some more text here. I add, now is the time for all good men to come to the aid of their country. And maybe I type, all good boys do fly. I guess it's all do birds fly. Well, you can see because I press it to the next line, the page break is still going to function the same way, and this whole page is going to be blank. Now I will keep the number 5 on the top of the first page that it's on, but you can see how I don't want to have a blank page or virtually blank page in the middle. So that's why you don't want to worry about putting in hard page breaks until you're sure that you're not going to be adding or subtracting content. But let's say we're to the point that we're about ready to print this document up. Well, then we're going to put the page break so we don't start a heading at the very bottom of a page. Again, that's not going to be an issue with letters because we're only going to do one-page letters, but for other documents, it can become an issue. Okay, so let's talk about our mode of delivery. This is going to go on the line under the date. Usually people don't space this one out, so it's not going to be, I said before you do the letter, then we're probably going to skip a line and do the date. We're probably not going to skip a line before our mode of delivery. Part of the reason we don't skip a line is that this isn't going to be anywhere close geographically on our letter to our date. So it's not going to look weird with them stacked right on top of each other. Having said that, if you want to space out your letter a little bit, maybe your letter is really, really short, you don't have a lot to say, and so the whole body of the letter seems to be in the top half of the page. Maybe you have a very small letterhead, for example. Well, if you wanted to, you could put another line here. So, you do have a little bit of flexibility. Okay, so the rule of thumb about mode of delivery is that we're going to include it in every letter in this class. Once you get out and you're practicing, you may find that your law firm says, well, when we're sending it U.S. mail first class, we don't put the mode of delivery. Because that's the assumption. If you don't have the mode of delivery, people assume you sent it just regular mail, which is first class mail. But for this class, we're going to include it every time, mainly just to reinforce that idea that we need to have the mode of delivery. So go ahead and include it for this particular class. If there's a tracking number, as you'll oftentimes have with FedEx or UPS or certified mail return receipt requested, and by the way, certified mail return receipt requested is very popular with attorneys. It's a good idea to include the tracking number. It helps you, it helps the recipient. You don't have to, but it is a best practice. So you can include that. And if you do have the tracking number, you're going to want to likely put that on the second line because the tracking number is usually typically fairly long and you want to keep your mode of delivery kind of in its little pocket on the right side. So let's look at what that's going to look like. Here we go. I don't think I have an example. I don't. Okay, so let me add an example here. Example. Okay, so I'm going to put this on its own fresh line. Okay, so the only thing you're going to have on your mode of delivery line is the mode of delivery. And so we're going to go up here. Right now, this is what's called left justification. I guess Word calls it align left, but most people call it left justification. And this is center. Well, this is right justification. So I'm going to hit right justification, and you can see it moves it all over here. It's like we were going to be writing in a language like maybe Hebrew, or I'm sure there's others, that goes from right to left instead of left to right. So I'm going to type here via U.S. first class mail. And that's all that I need to put in it. It's pretty common for people to underline it or italicize it or do both. For this class, I'm not requiring it, but it is a pretty common thing to do. So I'm going to do it here just so you can see what it looks like. Let's say we wouldn't have, actually, I'm going to switch this to certified mail. Certified mail, return, receipt, requested. So you can see this has taken up about half of my line. So I really don't want to just do a, tracking number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I mean, you can see this now virtually the whole line. So what most people would do in this situation is just put the tracking number on the second line. And so this is how it would look. You want to also have the second line also be right justified. What sometimes people do, and don't do, I'm discouraging you from doing this because you will get a deduction, is that they will keep the left justification and merely tab over. And they'll tab over until they, oops, that's too far. So they'll do it like this. And then they'll do the same with this. Tab over until they can't tab anymore. And then they have this. That's why I require you submit your documents in Microsoft Word, so I can check. I can check to see if you actually centered your date, and I can also see, did you actually write justify? And so go ahead and write justify it so that you won't get a deduction. So I'm going to switch these two lines to write justification. Here we go. So this is an example of how it would look. And now we're good to go. We're ready to move on to our next section, which we will do in our next tape. So again, let's just go over the important things to keep in mind. Number one, format your document before you get started. If you haven't written this stuff down, pause me so you can get it down. Don't change your letterhead. Do the date in the standard format and make sure you tab over to put the date in the approximate center. Always use mode of delivery in this class. Be sure to write justify that. And you're good to go. You've already mastered very significant parts of the legal letter. Thanks for your attention, and I hope that you have a wonderful day. Take care.